Imagine this. You land in London for the very first time, grab a rental car, and the moment you pull out of the airport, you realize something feels totally off. Cars are zipping by on the opposite side of the road. The steering wheel is on the wrong side, and suddenly you feel like you're driving through an alternate universe. That's when it hits you: Americans drive on the right. But the British, Australians, and a handful of others, they drive on the left. And if you're like most people, you probably just take it for granted that in America, the right side of the road is the natural place to be. But here's the question. Why? Why do Americans drive on the right side instead of the left? Was it some random decision? Was it a government mandate? Or was it born out of something deeper? Something about history, culture, even psychology? Let's rewind back in time. Because to understand why Americans ended up driving on the right, we need to go back to the era before cars even existed. Picture the 1700s and 1800s, long before highways and SUVs, when roads were little more than dirt paths carved by wagons, horses, and people on foot. The way people traveled then has everything to do with why we drive the way we do now. In medieval Europe, most people actually traveled on the left side of the road, and it wasn't because they were following some government law. It was simply practical. Imagine you're a knight on horseback in the 14th century. You carry your sword in your right hand because, well, most people are right. If you're riding down a narrow road and another knight approaches, it makes sense to keep to the left so that your sword arm is closer to your opponent. That way, you're ready to defend yourself if things get heated. In other words, left side travel was all about safety and preparation for combat. Fast forward to the American colonies in the 1700s. Things start to shift. America wasn't filled with sword-wielding knights. Instead, it was filled with farmers, traders, and settlers moving goods in large wagons. And here's where it gets interesting. These wagons were often pulled by teams of horses, sometimes for 6 or even more. The drivers didn't sit on the left or the right side of the wagon like we do in modern cars. They often sat on the left rear horse of the team, holding the reins with their left hand, keeping their right hand free to use a whip if needed. Sitting on the left gave them better control of the horses, but it also created a problem. When two wagons passed each other on a narrow road, the driver needed to be able to see the edge of the road to avoid collision. By sitting on the left and traveling on the right side of the road, he had a clear line of sight. That's one of the earliest roots of Americans, favoring the right side. It was about practicality, not law. But there was another influence, too, and it came from none other than France. During the French Revolution in the late 1700s, aristocrats traditionally traveled on the left side of the road while commoners kept to the right. When the revolution broke out, the symbolism of the split was huge. As the revolutionaries rose up, they declared that everyone should drive on the right almost, as a way of saying, we're equal now. Napoleon Bonaparte later enforced right-side travel across much of Europe as his empire expanded. Countries influenced by Napoleon, like Belgium, Switzerland, and Italy, adopted the right side. Meanwhile, countries that resisted Napoleon, like England, stuck to the left. So in a way, America's choice of road travel was influenced by revolutionary ideas, practicality, and even global politics. Now let's come back to America in the early 1800s. Cities are growing, trade is booming, and the young nation is building its identity. More and more states began passing laws that encouraged or required travel on the right side of the road. Pennsylvania set an early precedent in 1792 with a law requiring wagons on the Philadelphia and Lancaster Turnpike to keep to the right. Gradually, this standard spread across the United States. It wasn't overnight, but by the mid-1800s, traveling on the right side was becoming the American way. And then came the automobile. This is where things really locked into place. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, cars were just starting to replace wagons and carriages. At first, there was no universal agreement on which side the steering wheel should go. Some manufacturers placed it on the right side of the car, others on the left. But then, Henry Ford entered the picture. When Ford introduced the Model T in 1908, it became the most popular car in America almost overnight. And guess what? The Model T had the steering wheel on the left. This was a game changer. With the steering wheel on the left, it made sense to drive on the right side of the road. Why? Because it gave the driver a better view of oncoming traffic and allowed passengers to exit safely onto the sidewalk instead of into the street. Once millions of Americans bought the Model T, the left-hand steering, right-side driving standard became the norm across the country. At that point, the United States had fully embraced driving on the right. It wasn't just tradition anymore, it was law, reinforced by car design and mass production. By the 1920s and 1930s, every state in America officially required driving on the right side of the road. And unlike Europe, where countries remained split between left and right, the United States had a massive advantage: consistency. Imagine if one state drove on the left and the next state overdrove on the right, it would be chaos. Thankfully, America had the size, the growing highway system, and the influence of Ford's cars to unify the entire country under one system. But here's the thing: Americans weren't alone in choosing the right side. Today, about 70% of the world's population drives on the right. That includes Canada, China, Russia, and most of mainland Europe. Only about 30% places, like the United Kingdom, Ireland, Australia, India, Japan, and a few others stick to the left. The reasons vary. In the UK, tradition and resistance to Napoleon played a big role. In Japan, it was influenced by British engineers who helped design their railways and early roads. But in America, it was this perfect storm of horse-drawn wagons, revolutionary spirit, state laws, and the Ford Model T that made right-side driving the national standard. Now, let's pause and think about the psychology behind it. Humans are creatures of habit. Once a society establishes a norm, whether it's driving on the right or using the metric system, it becomes part of the culture. Imagine if tomorrow, the government announced that Americans had to switch to driving on the left. Highways would need to be redesigned, cars would need to be rebuilt, and people would need to completely retrain their instincts. It would be chaos. Accidents would skyrocket, and the cost would be astronomical. That's why once a country picks a side, it sticks with it. The choice becomes baked into the national identity. For Americans, driving on the right is just as natural as baseball in the summer or pumpkin pie in the fall. It feels American, even if the roots go all the way back to Europe and horse-drawn wagons. Another fascinating layer to this story is how it highlights the American spirit of practicality. Unlike some traditions that linger because of nostalgia, the American choice to drive on the right was born out of efficiency and common sense. Farmers and traders needed a better view of the road. Laws helped create order, and car manufacturers like Ford locked in the design. It wasn't about following what other countries were doing. It was about creating a system that worked best for America at the time, and once it worked, it stuck. That, in many ways, is the American way of doing things. And if you want an example of just how deep this choice runs, look at what happens when Americans travel abroad. Ask anyone who's driven in England, Australia, or Japan, and they'll tell you it feels completely unnatural to drive on the left. It is not just about the steering wheel being on the other side, it is about decades of muscle memory. American brains are wired to look left first when crossing the street, to merge right, to pass on the left. Driving on the left feels almost like writing with your non-dominant hand. It shows how powerful this cultural habit really is. Of course, Americans aren't the only ones who struggled with this question. Some countries actually switched sides in modern history. Sweden, for example, drove on the left until 1967, when they made the switch to the right. It was called H-Day, or Högertrafikförmedling. Imagine the entire country waking up one morning and suddenly everyone had to drive on the opposite side. It sounds like a recipe for disaster, but Sweden pulled it off, with surprisingly few accidents. Still, the cost and planning that went into that change shows why it almost never happens. For America, switching to the left has never been on the table, because by the time cars took over, the right side was already firmly entrenched. So, why do Americans drive on the right side of the road? It's not because one person made a random decision. It's the result of centuries of history, from knights carrying swords to farmers driving wagons. Two revolutionaries demanding equality to Henry Ford selling millions of cars. It's a story of practicality, culture, and identity. And it is a reminder that even something as simple as the side of the road we drive on has deep roots in history. Next time you're cruising down an American highway, maybe with the windows rolled down and music blasting, think about the journey that got you there. Think about the farmers guiding their wagons, The lawmakers writing early traffic rules, the revolutionaries demanding equality, and the car makers designing vehicles for the future. All of that history led to this one simple, everyday habit: driving on the right side of the road. And here's the beautiful part. Something as ordinary as driving connects us to centuries of human decisions, struggles, and inventions. It is not just about rules of the road, it's about how societies evolve and how small choices add up to big cultural identities. Americans drive on the right because it made sense, it worked, and it became part of who we are. So the next time you're behind the wheel, maybe on a long road trip across Route 66, or just heading to the grocery store, remember, you're not just driving on the right side. You're driving on the side of history, and that, in its own way, is pretty incredible.